There's a specific kind of person who moves through life quietly carrying weight that no one else can see. They wake up, they function, they smile when expected, they nod when spoken to, they fulfill their responsibilities. But beneath the surface, beneath the composed exterior, there is an ocean of pain that never gets spoken about. Not because they don't want to share it, but because something deeper, something psychological, keeps them locked in silence. And if you've ever been that person, or if you know someone who is, then you understand that suffering in silence isn't about being strong. It's about something far more complex, far more human, and far more heartbreaking than most people realize. See, people who suffer in silence don't choose silence because it feels good. They choose it because, at some point, they learned that speaking up felt worse. Maybe they opened up once and were met with dismissal. Maybe they shared their pain and someone told them they were overreacting. Maybe they reached out and the person they trusted made it about themselves. Or maybe, worst of all, they spoke their truth and were met with complete indifference, as if their suffering didn't matter enough to be acknowledged. And when that happens enough times, something shifts in the mind. You stop seeing vulnerability as a bridge to connection. You start seeing it as a risk you can no longer afford to take. Psychologists call this learned silence, and it's one of the most common psychological adaptations in people who have been emotionally neglected, invalidated, or abandoned. The mind learns through pattern recognition. If every time you express pain, you experience rejection or minimization, your brain begins to categorize emotional expression as dangerous, not intellectually, but instinctively. Your nervous system starts to associate vulnerability with threat, and over time, you build walls not to keep others out, but to keep yourself safe from the harm that comes when people don't hold your emotions with care. But here's what makes this psychology so complex. People who suffer in silence aren't always quiet about everything. They can be social, even talkative. They can laugh, engage, participate in conversations. They can listen to others with deep empathy and offer comfort without hesitation. But when it comes to their own pain, their own struggles, their own inner chaos, they retreat into silence. It's selective vulnerability. They give pieces of themselves, but never the pieces that hurt the most. And this creates a strange paradox. The people closest to them often have no idea how much they're suffering because the mask is so carefully maintained, so skillfully crafted, that even those who love them cannot see through it. And this isn't manipulation, it's not deception, it's protection. When you've learned that your pain makes people uncomfortable, that your struggles make you a burden, that your emotional needs push people away, you adapt. You learn to compress your suffering into something smaller, something manageable, something that doesn't require anyone else's attention. You become an expert at minimizing your own feelings. You tell yourself, it's not that bad, or other people have it worse, or I'll deal with it later. You rationalize your silence until it feels like the only reasonable option. But silence doesn't make pain disappear. It just changes where the pain lives. Instead of being expressed outwardly, it gets internalized. It becomes part of your internal landscape, a constant companion that you carry everywhere but show to no one. And over time, this internalized suffering reshapes your psychology in profound ways. You become hyper-aware of other people's emotions while becoming disconnected from your own. You develop an acute sensitivity to tension, to changes in tone, to subtle shifts in someone's energy. But when someone asks you, "How are you feeling?" you genuinely struggle to answer because you've spent so long suppressing your feelings that you've lost touch with them. This is what psychologists call emotional suppression, and research shows it has serious consequences. When you consistently push down emotions rather than processing them, your body keeps the score. The stress doesn't disappear. It manifests as physical symptoms: chronic fatigue, headaches, digestive issues, muscle tension, insomnia. Your body becomes the voice that your words never were. And still, even with these physical signs, people who suffer in silence often won't seek help. because seeking help requires breaking the silence, and breaking the silence requires trusting that someone will actually listen, actually care, actually understand. And that trust feels impossible when it's been broken too many times before. There's another layer to this psychology that often goes unrecognized. Many people who suffer in silence were once children who had to be emotionally self-sufficient. Maybe they grew up in households where emotions were inconvenient, where problems were meant to be handled privately, where crying was seen as weakness. Maybe they had parents who were too overwhelmed with their own struggles to hold space for a child's feelings. Or maybe they learned early that their emotional needs created conflict, tension, or disappointment in the people they depended on. So they learned to need less, to ask for less, to be less of a problem. And that childhood adaptation becomes an adult pattern. Even when circumstances change, even when they're surrounded by people who would genuinely support them, the psychological imprint remains. They still minimize their needs. They still downplay their pain. They still suffer alone because that's the only way they know how to survive emotionally. And the tragedy is that this silence often gets misinterpreted. People see someone who seems fine, who seems capable, who seems like they have it all together, and they assume everything is okay. They don't realize that the composure is a carefully constructed facade, that the strength is actually exhaustion disguised as resilience, that the silence is a scream that's been turned inward. People who suffer in silence develop a unique relationship with their own emotions. They become observers of their own pain rather than participants in it. They can describe what they're feeling with remarkable accuracy, but they describe it with the emotional distance of someone reporting the weather. I'm feeling anxious today. I'm a bit sad. I'm overwhelmed. The words are there, but the emotional weight behind them is carefully controlled, carefully measured, carefully kept at arm's length, because letting the full weight of those emotions be felt, be expressed, be witnessed, feels too vulnerable, too risky, too exposing. And this creates exhaustion of a particular kind. Not the exhaustion of doing too much, but the exhaustion of feeling too much while showing too little. It's the tiredness that comes from carrying emotional weight in isolation, from processing pain without support, from navigating inner storms while maintaining an outer calm. This exhaustion doesn't show up in obvious ways. It shows up in subtle withdrawals, in shortened responses, in the need for more alone time, in the inability to engage with anything that requires emotional energy. But when people ask if they're okay, they still say yes, because saying no, really saying no, would require explaining everything they've been holding, and that feels impossible. Here's what most people don't understand about suffering in silence. It's not that these people don't want connection. They crave it desperately. They long for someone to see through the facade, to ask the right questions, to create space that feels safe enough to finally speak. But they also fear it intensely, because vulnerability requires trust, and trust requires evidence that your emotions will be handled with care. And when that evidence is missing from your history, when past experiences have taught you that opening up leads to pain, your mind creates barriers to protect you from repeating that trauma. Psychologists describe this as an approach avoidance conflict. Part of you desperately wants to share, to be understood, to be supported. But another part of you, the part that's been hurt before, fights to keep you silent, to keep you safe, to prevent the possibility of being hurt again. And you exist in this constant internal tension, pulled between the need for connection and the need for protection. It's mentally exhausting, it's emotionally draining, but it's the only way your psyche knows how to keep you safe. There's also a deep shame that often accompanies suffering in silence. Not shame about the pain itself, but shame about the inability to speak about it. You watch other people express their emotions easily, casually, without fear. You watch them ask for help, receive support, and move through their struggles with the assistance of others. And you wonder what's wrong with you. Why can't you do that? Why does the thought of opening up make your chest tighten and your throat close? Why does vulnerability feel like standing on the edge of a cliff? And this shame becomes another layer of suffering, another thing you can't talk about, another weight you carry in silence. But people who suffer in silence also develop extraordinary psychological capacities. They become deeply empathetic because they understand pain intimately. They become exceptional listeners because they know what it feels like to need someone to listen. They become incredibly attuned to others' emotions because they've spent years analyzing their own in isolation. They become the friends people turn to in crisis, the ones who can hold space for others' suffering without judgment or discomfort. And they do this willingly, generously, consistently, because helping others process their pain is easier than processing their own. Because being there for someone else creates purpose, creates meaning, creates a way to transform their own suffering into something useful. But here's the heartbreaking reality. While they're busy being everyone else's support system, their own emotional needs remain unmet. They give and give and give, but they don't know how to receive. When someone offers them support, they deflect, they minimize, they redirect the conversation. They say, "I'm fine," or "It's nothing," or "You don't need to worry about me." Because accepting care feels uncomfortable in ways they can't quite articulate. It feels like being a burden. It feels like taking up space they don't deserve. It feels like admitting they're not as strong as everyone believes them to be. And this is where the psychology becomes particularly complex. People who suffer in silence often have incredibly high standards for themselves, but incredibly low expectations of others' capacity to support them. They expect themselves to handle everything independently, to be emotionally self-sufficient, to process pain without assistance, but they don't expect others to be able to handle their emotions, to understand their struggles, to show up for them consistently. This isn't arrogance or superiority, it's protection based on experience. They've learned that people are more comfortable with their strength than with their vulnerability, so they only show the parts of themselves that others can comfortably witness. There's also a temporal dimension to this suffering. It's not just about present pain being held in silence. It's often about accumulated pain, layers of unprocessed emotions stacked on top of each other over years, sometimes decades. Old hurts that were never addressed, past traumas that were never spoken about, disappointments that were swallowed rather than expressed. All of it gets stored somewhere in the psyche, in the body, creating an inner archive of suffering that grows heavier with time. And because it's never been released, never been witnessed, never been validated, it continues to influence their present emotional state in ways that are difficult to name. When something new happens, something painful or difficult, it doesn't exist in isolation. It activates all those old, unspoken wounds. A small rejection today can feel catastrophic because it's connected to every other rejection they've silently endured. A minor disappointment can trigger deep despair because it's layered on top of a lifetime of unacknowledged disappointments. But they can't explain this to others because they've never talked about the original wounds. So the intensity of their internal reaction feels disproportionate to the external event. So they hide it, they suffer through it alone, and the silence continues. The psychology of suffering in silence also involves a particular kind of loneliness. Not the loneliness of being physically alone, but the loneliness of being emotionally unknown. You can be surrounded by people, be in relationships, have friends and family, and still feel profoundly isolated because no one really knows what you're carrying. You exist in two worlds simultaneously: the outer world, where you function, where you meet expectations, where you play your role, and the inner world, where you struggle, where you hurt, where the real you exists in all your complexity and pain. And the gap between these two worlds creates a sense of disconnection that's hard to articulate. You long for someone to bridge that gap, to ask the questions that would unlock your silence, to create the safety that would allow you to finally speak. but you also fear that moment intensely. Because what if you finally open up and they don't understand? What if you show them your pain and they minimize it? What if you reveal the depth of your suffering and it changes how they see you? What if your vulnerability makes them uncomfortable and they pull away? These fears keep the silence intact, keep the suffering private, keep the distance maintained. But here's something crucial that people who suffer in silence need to understand. Your silence makes sense. It's not weakness, it's not a character flaw, it's a psychological adaptation to experiences that taught you that speaking was unsafe. Your mind is protecting you in the only way it knows how. And while that protection served a purpose, while it kept you safe in circumstances where safety was scarce, it may no longer be serving you. The circumstances may have changed even if your psychological patterns haven't. And recognizing that, understanding the origins of your silence, is the first step toward potentially choosing something different. Because suffering in silence takes a toll that accumulates over time. It impacts your mental health, your physical health, your relationships, your sense of self. It creates a life where you're perpetually disconnected from authentic connection, where you're always performing rather than being, where you're chronically alone even in the presence of others. And while breaking that silence feels terrifying, while it requires vulnerability that goes against every protective instinct you've developed, it's also the path toward genuine connection, toward being truly known, toward experiencing the relief of having your suffering witnessed and held by someone who cares. The journey from suffering in silence to finding your voice is not linear. It's gradual, uncertain, and often frightening. It requires finding people who have earned the right to hear your story, people who have demonstrated through consistent action that they can hold your emotions without judgment or dismissal. It requires starting small, sharing minor struggles before major ones, testing whether vulnerability will be met with care or carelessness. It requires learning to distinguish between people who are safe and people who aren't, between those who can handle your truth and those who can't. And even then, even with safe people, speaking after years of silence is difficult. The words feel stuck, inadequate, too heavy to lift out of your chest. You might cry when you don't expect to. You might minimize even as you're trying to be honest. You might apologize for taking up space, for being too much, for burdening them. Old patterns don't disappear immediately, but each time you speak, each time you allow someone to witness your pain, you're rewiring neural pathways that have kept you silent. You're teaching your nervous system that vulnerability can be met with care, that your suffering matters, that you deserve to be supported just as much as you support others. People who suffer in silence are some of the strongest, most resilient individuals you'll ever meet. Not because suffering in silence is strength, but because they have endured so much with so little support. They've carried mountains alone. They've processed pain in isolation. They've survived internal storms that would break others. But strength doesn't have to mean suffering alone. True strength might actually be the courage to break the silence, to let someone in, to trust that your pain is valid and deserving of care. If you're someone who suffers in silence, please know this. Your pain is real, even if no one sees it. Your struggles matter, even if you've never spoken them aloud. Your emotions are valid even if they've been dismissed in the past, and you deserve support, care, and understanding just as much as anyone else. The silence you've carried has protected you, but it doesn't have to define you forever. You have the capacity to find your voice, to share your suffering, to let someone walk beside you instead of always walking alone. And when you do, when you finally break that silence with someone safe, you might discover something profound. That being witnessed in your pain, being held in your vulnerability, being accepted in your struggle, creates a kind of healing that silence could never provide. You are not too much. You are not a burden. You are human. And humans were never meant to suffer alone.